Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, Melderon here. Before I get started with this video, I'd like to state that this is obviously an opinion piece. Something that my brother and I pride ourselves on is that we have built a community that digests ideas and discusses them, rather than a community that just takes what we say as gospel. We never want to create an echo chamber of thought. Rather, we firmly believe that discourse and freedom of ideas and conversation are of the utmost importance. So if you agree or disagree with this opinion, let us know. As long as you are respectful, we will do our best to reply. Also, we'd like to thank Druid Theory Crafter and friend Taladrill for helping us write this script. I realize that the title of this video may seem extreme. However, the reason is simple. Blizzard devs are undertaking the massive task of bringing us classic, and they are being as faithful as they can to make the game as close to original as possible. I applaud their efforts, and they are doing a great job. However, I expect that they are going to make a mistake by implementing world buffs as is. World buffs existed in vanilla and should exist in the game, with their mechanics and effects unchanged, but with one exception. World buffs should be removed from players automatically when they zone into a raid instance. This video will explain world buffs' impact on raids, the damage they do to player experience, and why their use, specifically in raids, is the definition of a significant gameplay exploit. We can all agree that vanilla had a lot of unique quirks and oddities. However, things that constitute exploiting the game are not beneficial to the health of the game. I hope that anything found to be something that meets the criteria of an exploit, regardless of its presence in vanilla, would be fixed by the developers for Classic. Before going into the discussion, let's go over what an exploit is. From Wikipedia. In video games, an exploit is the use of a bug or glitches, game system, rates, hitboxes, speed or level design, etc. by a player to their advantage in a manner not intended by the game's designers. Keep this definition in mind when seeing how world buffs affect the user experience. You will see that world buffs are an exploit because players utilize the game's system to their advantage to simplify raid encounters. And this behavior was not intended by the original developers. With the understanding of how world buffs could fit the criteria of being an exploit, let's turn to some pros and cons of their presence in the game, and then get into the day-to-day of how they are utilized by the players. World buffs add a significant incentive to do world PvP events. This is probably the biggest pro to keeping world buffs in as is. World buffs are understandably extremely sought after, so it can be incredibly rewarding for a guild to lie in wait to destroy an opposing faction's guild who's about to enter their weekly raid with world buffs. Additionally, with solo PvP play, players such as priests can remove world buffs while lying in wait at raid instances to the same effect. World buffs cause more general world interaction. Since you get these in Dire Maw, on Zandalar Island, in Felwood, and even at the Dark Moon Fair, your chances of running across opposing faction players is higher. World buffs provide additional competition for the highest level guilds. A wipe will be a guaranteed loss of any chance of competitiveness from that guild or any member of that raid team for the week. The guilds that do the content without wiping will be the competition to beat. In general, world buffs make your character feel a lot stronger, which can be fun for DPS and tanking classes. I think this reason is why there isn't a discussion about this issue. To discuss it is to invite a nerf to yourself, and we all know how important it is to see those big numbers. Am I right? Lastly, world buffs foster a sense of accomplishment. This goes with the mentality that if you work hard, you should be rewarded well. In other words, those that put in the effort and the time to achieve these buffs feel accomplished. There are likely other pros that people might throw out there, but this hits all of the big points. Now let's move to the cons where, honestly, there are quite a few. Let's start by rebutting the world PvP point since people generally care about this aspect the most. World buff PvP action is short-lived and oriented around ganking. It isn't like epic battles in South Shore versus Tarren Mill. One side just wants to get their buffs and then go into the raid, and the other is just looking to stop them. Once one side is victorious, everyone moves on. The opportunity provides the incentive, and destroying a whole raid is fun, but it is not continued organic open world PvP. Additionally, talking about PvP and competition, there would be strong incentive towards collusion between guilds and factions to sabotage top-performing guilds from doing raids with world buffs, or even for top guilds to keep in check lesser guilds on the same server with planned attacks against these guilds on their raid day. World buffs are a de facto requirement for virtually any quality guild. Even low-level guilds still will put a lot of pressure onto people to get buffs before every raid. Getting world buffs is busy work drudgery that forces people to do the same thing over and over again. While you might say the same about consumables, remember that these can be bought with gold, and you can farm gold in many different ways, adding more gameplay variety. After getting world buffs, you must log off your character so that the buff timers don't go away. People routinely get buffs the day before the raid, meaning that your main character is inaccessible from anywhere between an hour before the raid to a day or even longer. This, in my opinion, negatively impacts the game as the world feels more empty. You are missing out on social interactions that may benefit the server as a whole. Since world buffs have such a strong effect, and a raid wipe removes these buffs, high-performing players in non-top tier guilds won't be able to compete directly in standings against those in top guilds. World buffs effectively boost the group as well as the individual, while members of guilds who lack world buffs hinders both the group and the individual. And because of the direct issue in the con above, losing world buffs in raids is the ultimate morale destroyer. The effect of world buffs being lost sours an entire raid night and can happen within the first 5 minutes of the raid. This effect is predictable and extremely unpleasant to be part of. So far I've mentioned 6 cons, and I haven't even gotten to the biggest problem of world buffs. World buffs flat out trivialize content. I'll say that again, world buffs flat out trivialize endgame PvE content. People do so much more damage and get a lot of increased survivability as well. Put that together and you can stomp content way easier, faster, and ignore many of the mechanics because of quick kill times. Stacking world buffs provides between 30 to 60% more total raid damage depending on the class and role. No, I'm not exaggerating. And additionally, over a 30% health pool increase for the entire raid. Let me reiterate. Depending on the class, world buffs add up to a 60% increase to damage. Having an entire raid with full world buffs increases raid strength to crazy levels. To put this in perspective, this is along the same lines of comparing 2 players' effectiveness where one has an optimal DPS build and the other has literally no talent points even assigned. Yes, it is that big of a difference. We can see that with this list, while world buffs may add a lot of fun with personal strength and ability, and more world encounters, there are a lot of downsides. Repetitive busy work to get buffs, immediately followed by required downtime in the form of logging off or playing on alts becomes the norm. Raids with world buffs are easier to the point of trivial for some, but instantly turn toxic when a mistake happens and a wipe removes all of the buffs. All this because of an artificial inflation of hidden flavor due to buffs that were never planned to be all stacked together. Let's take a little tangent to go over what the experience is like for players if world buffs are a thing in Classic. Those of you that haven't been around the private server scene can benefit from seeing how the flow works. You'll start out by taking a flight over to Feralis and then ride over to Dire Maul. Since your guild will often do it around the same time, 1 or 2 groups will do a quick tribute run. Once done, everyone there will enter a raid group, and with a cap of 5 people concurrently in the dungeon, 1 by 1 people will trickle in, piggybacking off the initial clear to get the buffs and then leave either by hearth or port. If you are acquiring these buffs the day before the raid, then you now log that character off until raid day. That's right, you can't play your main character until the actual raid starts. On raid day, or immediately following your Dire Maul buffs, you will go to Stormwind or Orgrimmar and log off. Since the Onyxia and Nefarian heads are on a timer, you'll now have to have a personal or guild-wide scout who will let you know when the buff is going out. By the way, the respawn timer is somewhere between 2 to 8 hours. Once the buff process starts, you'll have less than a minute to quickly log your character in to nab the buff. After getting it, you'll go ahead and log off now because the last buffs you'll get will be immediately before the raid. Okay, it's almost time to start the raid. Everyone is talking either on Discord or with alts since their mains are logged off, saving buff timers. Once the raid is ready to go, people will log on and quickly make their way to Zandalar Island either by flying, hearth, or summons. Once there, you get the ZG buff, and then everyone can finally head to the raid. However, some guilds look to get additional buffs. This Felwood Songflower takes more summons, or the entire raid flying over, and additionally you can also get Warchief's Blessing in Orgrimmar, which is really hard to get consistently. At this point, you're either wearily nodding with the familiarity of it all, or you are shaking your head saying there is no way that people will do this weekly. And you're right. They will do it twice a week. Never underestimate what people will do to take the easy route in an MMO, and world buffs are a quintessential easy route. Many of you guys are probably saying now, no, I refuse to believe that casual guilds will go through with this. This is a hardcore guild issue only. I'm sorry, but it won't be. We can see how guilds function on private servers to know exactly how this will play out. The requirement for world buffs seeps into every guild, and it's easy to see why. Early on, a guild may say no to world buffs. It's overkill and we don't need them. Life is good. But then 1 or 2 raiders gets them anyway, and now top the meters week after week. Now others in the guild want to see what they can do to compete against them, and they also see the strength of the buffs, so they get them too. And on and on and on until those truly casual enough to not care about raid progress at all are the ones not doing it. What's the real motivation for this? Meters? No, it's loot. Top performers have a better chance to get good gear. If you aren't that, then you aren't going to get the best items. If you want the best, you need to compete. And you cannot compete against world buffs, so it's either join or die. The major effect of this is that it is such bad gameplay. Look at all the downtime. Imagine game mechanics where the best way to play the game is to literally log out and not play your actual main character. But when you play the game that way, it makes you so overpowered that you trivialize the content that you do actually play. If you die, then it ruins your entire night. This is life with world buffs. I honestly believe this is an example of one of the worst gameplay designs in the history of World of Warcraft. Give me flying mounts. God, I can't believe I'm saying this, but even give me LFG. I don't care. It's not as bad as something that penalizes you for wanting to play the game with your main character. Okay, back on topic. This video started by saying that world buffs are an exploit. Bold statement, but hopefully the idea is softening a bit for you now. Let's keep going down this rabbit hole, shall we? We will now dive into a few historical exploits directly from Vanilla WoW, starting with the most infamous one, the Paladin Reckoning stacking incident. When this talent came out, there was no limit to the number of stacks you could build up, so someone was clever and spent hours building up hundreds of Reckoning stacks. And then, with his stacks, he went out and one-shot the world boss Lord Kha'Zix by himself. Blizzard then hotfixed this issue less than 24 hours later. Here's a fun one only fixed in patch 1.11, the Nax patch. Directly from the patch notes, instituted an anti-exploit measure on certain encounters, almost entirely raid bosses. These encounters will prevent people from zoning into the instance while that encounter is engaged. If you attempt to zone into the instance while that encounter is engaged, you will be resurrected at the outside entrance. This is primarily to combat graveyard rushing in instances. Before this fix, during Onyxia for example, if you died, you could simply do a corpse run, re-enter the raid, and continue to attack the boss during the same attempt. An even more significant exploit for allowing more player chances during a boss fight was out-of-combat rezzing. Back in the day, when your raid attacked a boss, and if you personally didn't do anything, you weren't put in combat. Well, early on, Molten Core was so hard, we sucked so much, that a common strategy to help defeat bosses was to have one or more paladins or shaman stand in the back and not engage and simply wait for someone to die, and then res them, heal them, and let them rejoin the fight, over and over again. We are so used to knowing that, apart from battle reses, everyone gets one chance to live for each boss fight. It's crazy to think that strategies were based on the opposite. Literally zerg the boss and res and do it again. But thankfully Blizz fixed it quick. Right? No! This was a problem that plagued MC in Blackwing Lair, and only in patch 1.9.3, a month into AQ and over 2 years after the game's release, was a fix added to finally put a stop to it. These exploits and many more were all fixed in vanilla. However, that doesn't mean that simply looking at what was fixed in vanilla and what wasn't is a good enough line to draw in the sand. There are many known exploits that people discovered in vanilla. Most were fixed by the time TBC came out, but not all. And some exploits existed in vanilla but weren't discovered until TBC or even in Wrath. Here's an exploit that will absolutely be fixed in Classic, even though it was one of the ones found in Wrath. Certain items existed that had 100% spell scaling. To explain this quickly, imagine an item that adds 2 fire damage to all of your melee attacks. By equipping gear focused on caster stats, if the gear added, let's say, 300 spell power, then now your melee attacks hit for 302 fire damage each attack. Enter the existence of what was dubbed the Fire Rogue. It's simply a rogue who wears a ton of caster gear and is based around Blaze Fury Medallion because that item we imagined is real, and that's how it behaved in vanilla. I say this will not be the case so confidently because this is an exploit. No changes would dictate that this remain at 100% scaling because that's how it was in vanilla. It's even how it was in TBC. However, to be no changes would be to break the very function of the class. A rogue who does twice his normal DPS because he's wearing stuff geared for mages? Not intended. All of these exploits listed are ones that directly affect raids, and I doubt anyone would argue that these mechanics are not exploits or that we should see them in Classic. All of them clearly are beyond how the devs wanted the raid encounters to play out, and yet, world buffs affect a raid far more than any of those exploits put together. Paladin Reckoning stacks, rezzing those that died in battle, and melee being built around a single item is still no comparison to buffs that increase raid-wide DPS by 30 to 60% and increase the entire raid's health pool by over 30%. That, tied to the detriment of gameplay that affects how players play their characters just to accomplish this. World buffs are a game-breaking exploit that can't be allowed to be used in raid instances. One critical issue in talking about exploits is that something isn't an exploit unless someone is using it. It's emergent gameplay that causes these things to surface. For the vast majority of vanilla, world buffs weren't used as they will be today. Is that true, or just hearsay? It's pretty well known that by Naxx, or at least by the end of it, the key takeaway for many players was that you needed these things called world buffs to be able to actually kill content. But surely world buffs were known before Naxx. Maybe not to the noobs out there, but at least to the top tier raiders. A recent Countdown to Classic interview with Death and Taxes member 1927 on episode number 94 went over this exact issue. His time raiding with his guild spanned AQ progression. While consumable usage happened, the raid never utilized world buffs. The players were even aware of the buffs as he mentioned using them for PvP, however they didn't use them in raids. This was one of the top guilds in the world on the bleeding edge of content. If they didn't use world buffs, no one did. Here's a brief excerpt.
Yeah, that's what's fun. I hear about guilds that get all the world buffs before going in, and the only time I would really ever remember getting world buffs was for PvP, and to make the highlight video, I collected a few, nothing too crazy. But as a hunter, you were low on the priority for consumables, so that was really not something I ever experienced too much. But it certainly wasn't as hardcore as the way things are today. And I heard about methods spending like 100 million gold going into debt to get their world first. But yeah, back then things just it was a simpler time, and things really hadn't got that competitive yet. So there was no real requirement. But like I said, Death and Taxes was a very try-hard guild, very competitive. So most of their members were engineers. But yeah, nothing, no requirement really as to what your professions were. I think I was leatherworking and skinning just to level up, but that turned out to be a relatively useless profession. But I wanted to make the switch to engineering because grenades and stuff like that were just coming into use by the time I was quitting, but I never really did. So no, it wasn't a requirement.
Make sure to check out the full interview on CountdownToClassic.com. It truly was the end of the game where the idea of using world buffs in raids came out. By that point, we know, again, that the devs were already focused on TBC, so the idea that world buffs could trivialize content was an exploit that wasn't worth the devs' time. Casual guilds weren't using it, only those going after Naxx gear were, and Naxx was famous for almost no one experiencing the content. So who cares? Move on to problems that actually affect players. Okay, but Melderon, everyone says that world buffs are required for Naxx. If we don't have world buffs in Classic, then we won't be able to actually beat Naxx. No, they aren't. We have learned so much about the game collectively as a community since vanilla. Research continued with private servers. Though they have their inherent inaccuracies, it is still no less true that they have been a massive vanilla WoW sandbox for years. People have optimized almost everything possible within the game. Classic raids will not need world buffs to beat Naxx. I can guarantee you that. Many exploits have been found in vanilla and plenty were fixed, but some weren't. Exploits aren't always found and they aren't always fixed. The Paladin Wreck Bomb was solved instantly because it was so broken. Others like the spell scaling exploits weren't found, so weren't fixed. When an exploit is fixed, it's fixed because of a combination of severity, ease of access, or frequency of use. We can see that world buffs perfectly fit the the criteria of severity, ease of access, and frequency of use to be an exploit. It is truly the trifecta of being a game-breaking issue. The effects of world buffs are severe and make challenging encounters easy and easy encounters trivial. Additionally, it imparts a lot of negative emergent gameplay not intended by the original developers. World buffs are extremely easy for people to access. Only the first 5 people in a 40-man raid have to even clear a Dire Maul tribute run. The other 35 can literally just run in the dungeon with no mental thought. The other buffs simply require you to stand in town or on an island. They are able to be used in every single raid. Dire Maul buffs have no cooldown. Dragon Slayer can be activated twice per raid member, giving 40 full weeks of buffs at 2 buffs a week. And ZG can be used once per person, but there's a raid lockout for every 3 days for ZG, also allowing 2 buffs a week. ZG is also extremely easy and popular for alts to run, so there's a never-ending supply of them. If left into the game, we will see the use of world buffs as early as possible and utilized in every single raid unless the issue is fixed. How do we go about fixing it? Easy. World buffs don't need to be removed from the game at all. They provide a fun and interesting aspect to Classic. However, if a player enters a raid instance, these buffs should be removed from the player. All 20 and 40-man raids shouldn't allow for the use of world buffs in any way for completion of the content. Dire Maul, ZG, Ani, and Nefhead, Songflower, and the Darkmoon Fair buffs all should not work in raids. These buffs can still be enjoyed and used in PvP, in soloing, in world content, and in dungeons, but don't break raids with world buffs. The relevant longevity and success of Classic WoW significantly relies on PvE content being as difficult as possible. Thanks for listening to this epic dive in world buffs. Hopefully it was entertaining and might have made you think about the game a little bit differently. You might agree with me, or you might not. It's a hard point to know what the devs would do since world buffs weren't removed in TBC or Wrath. It's just buffs. Buffs can't be an exploit, right? Oh hey, before I leave you, check this out. Patch 2.1.0. Fengus's Fury, Moldar's Moxie, Rallying Cry of the Dragon Slayer, Slipkick Savvy, and Spirit of Zandalar. These buffs will no longer work on targets over level 63. How about that? I guess Blizzard did fix this exploit, after all. Keep on keybinding and grinding, everyone. I hope to see you all in Classic Azeroth.